Hello there, I'm Kafi Khan and welcome back to my Android tutorial. In the previous video, we talked about installing of Android Studio and setting up the SDK. In today's video, we'll be talking about activities and layouts. Well, what is an activity? Anything that's visible on your Android screen is an activity. Or in another word, the building blocks of user interface is an activity. Activity consists of layouts and layouts consist of widgets. Layouts are of two basic types, linear layout and relative layout. Linear layout aligns its child views in a linear fashion, which could either be horizontal or vertical, whereas relative layout aligns its child views in a position relative to each other. Android supports multiple widgets, for example, text view, edit text, radio button, checkbox, date picker, etc. So, let's dive in. Let's create a new project. Let's call our project Activities and Layouts. You see this package name. So what this package name is, it's a unique identifier for your application on Google Play Store. It comprises of your application name and your company domain. So let's hit the next button. This drop-down defines the minimum SDK on which your application will run. We are gonna select API 15, and why is that? As you can see here, it's written by targeting API 15, our application will run on almost 100% of the devices running Android in the world. So let's hit the next button. Let's select an empty activity. Let's call our first activity as main activity. You can call it anything, but I'm just going to proceed with main activity. Let's hit the finish button. The Android is building our project, so let's wait. Well, the project's built and it's ready to go. So let's proceed. As you can see here, this is our project structure. We've got a Java folder and a resource folder, and the values folder will have color.xml, string.xml, and styles.xml. Styles.xml defines the style of your application, the primary color, the secondary color, the primary text color, the secondary text color, all those things. The colors.xml defines the colors, so it's just like you are defining variables, say red, and you assign a hexa code to that variable. And string.xml, here we create our strings, and we'll see that in some time. These two folders, Android test and test, contain files which contain code for automation, integration, and unit testing of our application. We'll get back to that later in some video in future. So today, let's get started with a layout. And here, as you can see, we've got a Java file and an XML file. So for each activity, you've got two files, a Java file and an XML file. Java file contains the functionality part. The XML file contains the user interface part. So let's start with the UI first. As you can see here, our parent layout is constraint layout. It was introduced recently in Android SDK 25. We'll get back to that later. So right now, let's get rid of that and design a linear layout. Okay. As you can see in the preview, we've got a text view which has text hello world. To understand these layouts, linear and relative layout, let's define some widgets and see how these layouts align their child views. So let's create an edit text. With match parent, height, wrap content. And now you must be wondering what's match parent and what's wrap content. So match parent is like whatever is the available space it allocates, it assigns that to your widget. Whereas wrap content just gives the amount of space which wraps your widget. Let's see that. Let's get rid of this text view right now. Now as you can see, this is the outline of my edit text. So the height is just wrapping my edit text, but the width stretches across the entire screen. So let's change the width to wrap content. Now as you can see here, the width is just wrapping our edit text, and the height is also just wrapping our edit text. Let's change both to match parent and see what happens. Match parent, match parent. Now as you can see, the outline is around the entire screen. So this means our edit text is in the entire screen. It takes the full height, it takes the full width. So let's change it back to wrap content. Let's give it a hint. And to define strings, I've already told you, we've got a string.xml files. So let's see how we define a string. Let's click on the project, resources, values, and string.xml. As you can see here, we've already got one string variable, application name, that's our app name. Okay, so let's define another string. String name, let's give it, say, hint username. Let's give the value, so username. Similarly, let's make it for password. And let's also create a label for a button. So hint password. Let's change the value to password. For the button, let's say label btn login. Let's give it a value login. Now coming back to our XML file, let's close this. Let's provide the hint. So hint username. Now as you can see here, in my edit text, I can see a hint username. Okay, let's define another edit text, which would be for password. Edit text, again with match parent, height wrap content, and let's give it a hint password. And now as you can see, on the screen only username is visible, but no password. And as you can see here, we've got some error, so let's see what that is. Okay, it says no orientation specified, and as I was telling you when I introduced linear layout, that it aligns its child views either orientation, vertical or horizontal. So we have to provide an orientation field. So let's define that attribute, orientation, let's give it vertical. Now as you can see, both our text are visible, username as well as password, and they are aligned vertically in a linear fashion. Okay, let's also define a button. Say again, match parent and wrap content, match parent, height wrap content. Let's provide it with a label, text, say label btn login. And now as you can see, we've got ourselves a simple form here with two edit text and one button. Okay, so let's align it in a horizontal fashion now. Let's change the orientation to horizontal. And now again, as you can see, we can only see username and everything else is hidden. Any guesses why? Well, that's because we've given the full width to our edit text username. So the other two widgets, they go out of the screen. It must be somewhere outside here, and that's why it's not visible. So let's change the width to wrap content. Wrap content. And now as you can see, we can see password, but we cannot see our button. Again, the same reason, because password has the width match parent. Okay, let's change that also to wrap content. And now as you can see, we can see all three of our widgets, both the edit text and the button. That's all for linear layout. We've seen both the orientations, vertical as well as horizontal. Let's see relative layout now. Okay, let's change this to relative layout. And now as you can see, everything's gone. Only one widget is visible. Why? Okay, let's select here. As you can see, it's showing the highlight for my edit text password over here, and the highlight for edit text username as well over here. Why? Because we haven't defined the relative positions yet, so everything is overlapped. So let's define that. And to define a relative position, we'll need some unique identifiers, right? So let's define the IDs for each widget. Say ed username. And for this, let's say ed password. And for this, let's say btn login. So let's align it in a vertical fashion, everything below each other. So we need our ed password below ed username. So let's say layout below and ed username. So now as you can see, the password is below ed username. Similarly, let's define the login button below ed password. So let's say layout below and ed password. And now as you can see, it's aligned in a linear fashion, vertical, just below each other. Although it's not exactly a linear fashion, we've just defined it that way. And even if I remove the orientation from here, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change anything. Why? Because we've aligned everything in a position relative to each other. Okay, that's all for relative layout. Now let's just get used to some widgets. And let's give this a match parent, and let's give this also as match parent. We can customize these edit text, we can change the color, we can increase the font size, we can decrease the font size, we can change the background color. There's so many things we can do with these. So let's try a few. Let's change the text size. Okay, let's define the dimensions. Let's say it's 16 dp. As you can see now, the username text is smaller than the password text. Okay, let's make this say text size 20 dp. And as you can see, the font size increased. And let's give the text size of button say 12 dp. And let's change the background color. Background Android color say black, and let's change our text color. Let's make it white. Similarly, you can do n number of customizations. Let's see some more widgets. Let's define a radio button. Radio button is enclosed in a radio group, so let's define a radio group first. Say radio group, match parent, wrap content, and let's define a radio button. Again, match parent, wrap content, text, let's define a string. Say RB male. Let's define another string for female. Okay, coming back to our user interface. Say RB male. Similarly, let's define it for female. Again, as you can see, it's overlapping, so let's just change apparent layout to linear layout. And let's give the orientation vertical. And let's put this button at the bottom. Looks better now. Similarly, you've got so many other widgets, checkbox, date picker, I've already told you about. So that's all for today, folks. I've got a small homework for you. Go back, experiment with widgets, design forms, design layouts, and if you have any doubts, any queries, feel free to drop a comment. And if you need access to this code, it's already uploaded on my GitHub account, and the URL for that is in the description below. Again, if you need any help, any query, feel free to drop a comment and we'll get through it. Okay? See you in the next video. Hello there, I'm Kafi Khan and welcome back to my Android tutorials. In the previous video, we talked about activities and layouts. If you haven't watched the video, please watch it. In today's video, we'll be talking about explicit intents. To understand explicit intents, we need to understand intents first. So what is an intent? Intent is like a glue between activities, or in another word, it allows you to interact between components within the same application or different applications. That gives us two different types of intents, explicit and implicit. Explicit intent explicitly defines which component is to be called. For example, going from activity A to activity B. Whereas implicit intent defines the action to be performed. For example, click a photograph or view an image. In today's video, as I told you earlier, we'll be learning about explicit intent. Well, to understand explicit intents, we'll be making a small project which will have two activities. Let's call the first activity login activity. It will have a form with two input fields and a login button. When the user hits the login button, the application goes to the second activity which shows welcome username. So, let's create a new project. Let's name our project Explicit Intents. Let's hit the next button. And we'll be keeping our minimum API 15. Why? We talked in our previous videos that keeping the minimum SDK as API 15 means we're going to cover almost 100% of the devices running Android in the world. So let's hit the next button. We're going to start with an empty activity. Let's call the first activity login activity. Let's hit the finish button. Android Studio is building the project, so let's wait. The Gradle is built and our project is ready to go. Let's just close this notification, it's nothing. As you can see, this is our project structure. We've got some Java files, we've got some resources, and resources we've got layouts. So layouts will have our UI files, that is XML files. The values folder will have strings, colors. We've already talked about that. And the Java files will have our Java files. That is the functionality part. These two folders, Android test and test, we'll talk about that later. So let's begin. So first, the way I do my projects is I break it down into small steps. So what we're trying to achieve here is we're going to make an application with two activities, forms. So let's break it. So first we're going to need an activity with a form. So let's make a form first. Let's remove the constraint layout, which is going to go with a linear layout. If you ever wonder how I get the suggestions, when I type something, just do Ctrl plus space. So a form will have two fields, edit text, one for username and one for password, and we'll also have a button. So let's create a first edit text. With match parent, hide wrap content. Let's give it a hint. Let's define a hint in the string file. As you can see, the string file is in the values directory. So we've defined the first string. We've given it a name, hint, username. Let's define it for password as well. And let's also define it for the button label. So second would be hint password. Let's call the third one label login button. Coming back to our XML file, let's give the hint username. And as you can see here in the preview, we've got an edit text with the hint username. So let's create another edit text for our password. Again, let's provide the hint password. So now, as you can see, it's giving me some error over here and we can't see our password. So let's see what it is. No orientation specified. As you can recall in the previous video when we were talking about linear layouts, we also talked that it requires an orientation field which can either be vertical or horizontal. So in our case we're going to need it vertical. Orientation vertical. Now as you can see, the error is gone and we can see both our edit texts. Now let's create the button. Match parent, height wrap content, and the text label login button. Now our first step is finished. We've created a form successfully. So now the second step is when the user hits the login button, take the username and send it to the next activity. So the second step would be to fetch that username when the user hits the login button. So let's do that. So as I told you earlier, for the functionality parts, we'll be defining it in the Java file. So somehow what we need is a variable which can get me the text input from this username and password field. So for that, we're gonna create an object of type edit text. Let's do that. Edit text, ed, username. Let's keep it a private field. Now we've defined an object, not a variable, sorry, it's an object. So let's initialize it. ed username is equal to find view by id r.id.ed. We haven't defined the IDs yet. So let's go back to our XML file and define the IDs. The password, Similarly for button, let's define an ID, btn, login. So we've defined IDs for all three view items. So let's use that ID here, ed, username. So you must be wondering what this find view by ID does. So this is an inbuilt function of Android. What it does is, it returns the view corresponding to this ID. So we've got our ed username view in this object. Similarly, we'll be needing for the button, because when the user hits the button, then we're going to fetch the text from this edit text field. So let's create an object for the button field, private button btn login. We've declared our variable, let's initialize it. btn login is equal to, similarly, find view by id r.id.btn login. Well, so we've achieved this much so far. So now we have access to both our view items from the Java file. So what we want is when the user hits the login button. So what that means is we're going to somehow listen to that click event, right? So for that also we have got an inbuilt function from the Android. So let's use that. btn login dot set on click listener. New listener. So as you can see, I've used this function set onClick listener. What it does is, whatever you define inside this onClick function will be called whenever this button is hit. So in our second step, what we want to achieve is, when the user hits the login button, we want that text from the username edit text field. So let's get that. For that, we'll need a string variable, string, str, username is equal to ed username dot get text to string. So now you see I've used another function, get text. This is also an inbuilt function. What it does is, it gets the text from our edit text field, and as you can see, it returns an editable type, but we want it to be string, so that's why we've used another inbuilt function toString. So what this code snippet does is, it gets the text from the edit text fields and converts it into a string and stores it in a variable str username. So now that we've got the text in a variable str username, what we're going to need is, for the third step, another activity. As we can recall, the welcome activity. So let's go to project, right click on the Java, new, activity and empty activity. So let's call it welcome activity. Let's hit the finish button. Our activity is ready to use. So again, let's design the UI part first. And the second activity, all we're going to need is a text welcome username. So what we're going to use is a text field. Again, let's get rid of this constraint layout. Let's use a linear layout. Linear layout. Let's provide an orientation, say vertical, and provide and design a text field. Match parent, height wrap content. Let's give it an ID, txt, welcome. And our text view is ready. Let's provide it with a default string welcome. Let's define a new string. String name, let's say str welcome. Let's use this string here, text welcome. So as you can see, in our UI we have a welcome text. Now a third step is done. So far what we've achieved is, we've designed a form, we've handled the login button click. All we've got to do is now go from the activity A to activity B, which is from activity login to activity welcome. Here comes intent in the picture. So let's define an intent object. So how we define that is, let's see, intent, class name intent, object name, let's say intent is equal to new intent. We've created an intent object. It takes a to and from in the parameter if you want to go from one activity to another. So let's pass those. So we're going to go from login activity dot this to welcome activity dot class. So now we've defined an intent object which tells, okay, go from login activity to welcome activity. Remember, we also want to pass the data. And what is the data? This text field username. So let's do that. Intent dot put extra. Let's give a key, username, and pass a variable here. So now if you see this line, intent dot put extra x comma y. So put extra is an inbuilt function. What it does is, it takes a key value pair, and you can retrieve these values in your target activity using this key. So now we've defined an intent object, we've added the data. So let's start the activity. For that also we've got an inbuilt function, start activity, and we pass our intent to it. Start activity, and let's pass the intent. So far so good. We've completed our third step, which was, when the user hits the login button, set onClick listener, get the text from the username edit text, okay, this line, and then go from login activity to welcome activity and pass the data. Go from login activity to welcome activity and pass the data. So we've achieved that so far. Okay, let's go to our second activity, welcome activity. Here we're going to retrieve the string, as I told you, that put extra field. We passed a key value pair. Okay, let's define a variable string str username is equal to get intent get string extra, because we're passing a string. So this again is an inbuilt function, get intent. So whatever is the intent, we're getting that, and from that we're getting a string extra, and we're going to use the key which we defined here, which was username. So let's copy paste that. So now what the statement does is it gets the intent and gets the string extra value against the key username and stores it in a variable str username. So we've got the username from the previous activity, and we just gotta set it to the layout. For that, again, we're gonna access this text view somehow from this Java file. And remember, we've done that in the previous activity. For that, we're just gonna define an object of type text view. So let's do that. Private text view txt welcome, and we've just defined it. So let's initialize it also. Txt welcome is equal to find view by id r.id.txt welcome. So we've defined this object txt welcome, and we're getting a view against our id txt welcome, which is this text view. So now, time for the final step. We just gotta set this value here. So let's do that. Txt welcome dot set text. Let's say welcome plus and a variable str username. That's all. So we've achieved our target. Let's build the application and see what it does. This application Visor is an extension of Google Chrome. You can download it. What it does is it extends your Android smartphone's screen on your desktop so that we can see it. Okay, let's find the device. Here, let's select it. As you can see, okay, it's connecting. As you can see, my smartphone's screen is projected here. Let's run our application. As you can see, the Gradle is building and it's saying Gradle build running. So this is just building the application and it will run on my smartphone. Okay, as you can see, our application is running, and this was our first activity, which was login activity. It has a form with two fields, username, password, and a login button. So let's see what it does. Let's give it a username, say Kafi, July5. Let's give it some password. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5. And let's hit the login button. And our next activity is visible, which is welcome activity, and it shows me the message welcome Kafi. So that's all we wanted to achieve, and this is how explicit intent works. It tells your application to go from activity X to activity Y. That's all for today. If you have any doubts, any questions, feel free to drop a comment and we'll discuss about that. And if you need to access the code, the GitHub repository link is already in the description below. Just hit the site and see. And if you need any other help, again, feel free to drop a comment. See you in the next video. Hello there, I'm Kafi Khan and welcome back to my Android tutorials. In the previous video, we talked about explicit intents. If you haven't watched the video, please watch it. In today's video, we'll be talking about implicit intents. To understand implicit intent, we need to know what's an intent. Intent is like a glue between activities. It allows user to interact between components within the same application or different application. That gives us two types of intents, explicit and implicit. Explicit intent explicitly defines which component is to be called, for example, going from activity X to activity Y, whereas implicit intent defines which action is to be performed, for example, clicking a photograph or viewing an image. It doesn't tell us open the camera application. It says perform this action, capture image. And to understand implicit intent, we're going to make a small application with one activity. The UI would have one button. When the user hits this button, it will open the camera application. So let's get started. Let's create a new project and let's call it implicit intent. Let's hit the next button. Again, we're going to keep the minimum API as 15 so that we can cover 100% of devices running on Android in the world. Again, let's hit the next button. And let's create an empty activity. And let's call our activity as a capture image activity. Let's hit the finish button. Android Studio is building our project, so let's wait. Okay, the Gradle's built, our project is ready to go. Let's close this. Okay, let's start with the UI first. So again, let's take it step by step. So we're going to make an application with one activity, and the activity would have a UI with one button, and when the user hits the button, it opens the camera application. So step 1, let's create an activity, which we've already done. Step 2, design the layout. So in layout, we just need a button, so let's design that. Okay, let's get rid of this constraint layout. Let's give it an orientation, say vertical. Okay, and we don't need this text view, so let's get rid of this. We need a button, right? Button with match parent, white wrap content. Let's give it an ID. Say BTN capture image. And let's give it a label. And to define a label, we have to define a string, which we need to define in the string.xml file, which is located in the resources. So resources, values, string.html. So let's define a string here. Say str label capture button. Okay. Coming back to our UI part, let's define the label text str label capture button. Now, as you can see in the preview, we've got a button capture image. Step 2 done. Step 3, when user hits this button, we need to open the camera application. So again, step 3 means listening to the click event. So let's do that. And to listen to the click event, we'll need a reference of our button in the Java file. So for that, let's declare an object. Okay, because it's a button, so we're going to declare a button object. Button btn capture image. Let's make it private. Now we've declared our button object, so let's initialize it. btn capture image is equal to view by id r.id and our id for the button, which was btn capture image. Again, just to recall, find view by ID is an inbuilt function of Android which returns a view corresponding to the ID provider. So in our case, it returns a button view corresponding to the ID btn capture image. Okay, now we have to listen to the click event, so let's define that. btn capture image dot set on click listener new on click listener. So again, just to recall, on click listener is an inbuilt function of Android. So whenever user hits this button or whenever user hits this view, everything inside this on click block will be called. So in our case, we want to define an intent over there which calls the camera application. So let's do that. Intent is equal to new intent. So we've declared an intent object. If you remember, in explicit intents, inside this intent here, we define go from activity X to activity Y. But here we aren't doing that because this is an implicit intent and here we've got to define the action. So let's do that. Intent dot set action. Again, set action is an inbuilt function of Android. And let's define the action, which in our case is capture image. Media store, action image capture. So now so far we've defined our intent object and we've set the action, which is capture image. So let's start the activity. Start activity. Intent. Okay, it looks good so far. So let's run our application. To run the application, we just gotta hit this play button on the top. Let's hit it. Okay, let's hit the OK button. Again, let's open Visor. Just to recall, Visor is an extension of Google Chrome, and what it does is it projects your Android smartphone screen on your desktop. As you can see, our application is visible on the screen and we've got a button capture image. Let's hit it to see what happens. Now as you can see, it didn't open the camera app because I have multiple options, so it's asking me which one to open. So let's use the camera just once. Let's click the image. That's it. That's what implicit intent does. So, just to summarize, we set an on-click listener to a button. When the button was hit, we defined an intent which triggers an action to capture image. Now let's take this a little further. Say, for example, what we want is when the user clicks this image, the image should be visible on our layout. Again, this is a small project, step by step. Let's design the UI first. Coming back to our XML file. So because we want to show an image, so we'll need an image view. So let's define that. Image view with say 200 dp and height say 200 dp. Give it an ID, say img selected image. Sorry. As you can see in the preview, this outline shows this is my image view. So let's give it a background color to distinguish it. Background, say color, Android, say color, say darker gray. So as you can see here, this selected part, it's showing img selected image. So this is our image view. We've given it a background color as dark gray to distinguish it from the rest of the screen. Now coming back to a Java file. So what we want is when the user clicks the image should come back and should be visible on the screen. So for that coming back, whether you are working with implicit intent or explicit intent, we've got another inbuilt function in Android which is called start activity for result. So what it does is, whenever we need some data back from any activity or application, or via our intent, we use start activity for result. It takes two parameters, not one as compared to start activity. It takes an intent and a request code, which should be unique for our activity. So let's define our request code. Private final int, say capture image. Let's give it a random number, say 1. Coming down, let's change it to start activity for result. And as you can see, it's showing me an error. Let's pass our request code here. Capture image, and the error is gone. To access the return data, there's another function in Android, which is an inbuilt function on activity result. So let's override that function on activity result. As you can see, it's written here, override. So this is the default function, this part. We're just tweaking it to fit our requirement. So that's why we're overriding it. So let's see if the request code is capture image. And what we need to do is, we need to access the data. So as you can see here, our action is capture image. So the return data will be an image, right? So to save that image, we can use a bitmap. So let's create an instance of a bitmap. Say bitmap is equal to data, here intent data dot get extras dot get, and the key is data. As you can see here, it's giving incompatible types, and if you see the return type of get, it's an object. So to get rid of this error, we can use typecasting. So we're just gonna typecast it to bitmap. And those of you who don't know what typecasting is, it is conversion of one data type to another. So in our case, we're converting the object to bitmap. And still there's a warning that says get may produce null pointer exception. Just to avoid that warning, we can put an if condition there just to check if the data is not null. So if data is not equal to null and data dot get extras is not equal to null. Now as you can see, the warning is gone. So all I've done is I've just checked before executing this statement if the data is not null, and if the data is not null, I'm just checking if the get extras is also not null, if there is some data inside a data object. Okay, so now we've got the bitmap. What we want to do is we want to show it, we want to set it in the image view. So now that we've got our image stored in the bitmap, all we got to do is set it in the image view which we've defined in the layer. And as you can see here, we don't have any reference to that image view. So let's define that. So let's create an object of image view type. Private image view, img selected image. We've declared it, so let's initialize it as well. Again, find view by ID, it returns view corresponding to the ID. Now that we've declared as well as initialized our image view object, we can just set the value. img selected image dot set image bitmap. Let's pass our bitmap to it. Again, the set image bitmap is an inbuilt function of Android. All it does is it sets the bitmap to the image view. Looks like we're done here. Let's run the application and see what happens. you can see our application is running. We've got a button, we've got that dark gray patch which shows it's an image view. So let's hit the capture button and see what happens. Capture image, just once. Okay, now as you can see that image is visible here. Let's click another image. See, the image is visible in the image view. I have got a small homework for you. Now that you know what an implicit intent is and how to define, I want you to go back, make a small application, same application, one activity, one button. When the user hits this button, it opens the URL defined by you in a web browser. If there are any doubt, any questions, drop a comment, we'll discuss it, we'll get it through. If you need the code, I've already uploaded it in my GitHub repo, and the link for that is in the video description below. Again, so far, if you have any doubt, any queries, feel free to drop a comment and we'll discuss it, we'll go through it. Have a great day and see you in the next video.